Welcome to the Beyond the Reef podcast, where I talk to experts and researchers in the reef aquarium hobby, discussing a broad range of topics from corals and reef biology to water chemistry and equipment. We take a deep dive into our guests' methods, techniques, and top reef keeping tips. My name is Adam Sutherland, and I am the owner-operator of Frag Garage Corals, based out of British Columbia, Canada. This podcast is now brought to you by Fauna Marine. I was hesitant to bring on any sponsors, but since I use so many Fauna Marine products, I was really happy to have them collaborate with me. And also, I am now a certified ICP consultant, so if you send in a laboratory ICP test, you can select me as an advisor. Hey, what's up, folks? Welcome to a new year of Beyond the Reef. I thought for the first episode of 2025, we would do an episode with multiple guests talking about reinventing how we reef. Maybe if you've hit a bit of a plateau in your system, been trying a lot of the same things for a while and you're ready to try something different, I hope that this gets some ideas started for you. I'd like to thank all the guests for being a part of this. This was quite a bit of work to organize, so I hope you guys enjoy this episode. I'd just like to thank everybody that has signed up for the Patreon so far. Even the small subscriptions really help me out and help me make this worthwhile. As I've said before, I will never have any ads pop up in the middle of episodes. Unless you're not on YouTube Premium, because then you're probably going to have ads pop up. That's not on me, that's on you. But anyways, if you are looking for any consulting advice, and you want to go over an ICP or maybe an issue, you can sign up on my Patreon at patreon.com/beyondtherefpodcast, and you can do monthly consultations with me. You can also just do a one-off consultation if you want to do a PayPal. Just reach out to me at beyondtherefpod@gmail.com. My first guest should need no introduction, but this is Michael Paletta, longtime author and contributor to the reef hobby. The ammonia is a good example, obviously. Like, what was your kind of experience from, say, nitrate dosing to switching to ammonia, as far as like obvious things you noticed?
I got much faster growth, and I got a significant increase in the consumption of both alkalinity and calcium, and things stabilized significantly from there. Initially the nitrates kind of slowly creeped up, and then they plateaued, and then using that in combination with bolus of which is another thing I switched over to. Basically, the nitrates got consumed in 2 weeks. They went from 15 to 0 in 2 weeks. And that was with changing nothing. That was with the same feeding schedule. That was just, all of a sudden, they just took off after 3 months of bolus and a year and probably a year and a half of doing ammonia.
Okay. You must be doing a pretty massive bolus dose for a system of your volume, because your tank's what, like 400 gallons, something like that?
Total system 600 gallons.
600 gallons. So what is that like? You're probably dosing over a liter of alkalinity per day, I'm guessing.
I'm doing about 600 milliliters.
Okay. Yeah. And it's like, it's funny because you think, oh, holy, you're putting so much alkalinity in at once. But the bolus system, I do it on one of my systems, and I'll probably move my other systems towards that. But I can't say I saw a massive difference in that system, but that system was already on Fauna Marine Balling Light. So, I would say that probably now that I'm about 3 or 4 months in, I would probably say that system has better growth and color. But, it's like you often say, nothing good happens fast in a reef tank. So,
right.
But the bolus change was an immediate change. Like, I switched from dosing, my alkalinity split up over the day to, the one dose in the morning. And I definitely didn't notice anything bad happen. Is there a way to sort of measure?
I noticed that the pH tended to go up over time, and the swing of the alkalinity has also diminished.
Yeah.
Where the low now is around 7.5 and the high is about 8.2.
Yeah.
Where before, if I didn't dose for a day, I would get a point and a half change. So now it's seemingly much more stable.
Yeah,
it took 3 months.
Yeah, and that kind of goes against, people would think it would be less stable by dosing that way, but it has a way of sort of buffering that seems to sort of work really well. And I know there's a lot of criticism against the method, which I think is just kind of coming from old school kind of mentality that, like, how could that work? But there's newer ideas and newer science that kind of explains it, I think.
What's interesting is that's literally what we did 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Or 30 years ago when we started doing with SPS, and we were dosing Kalkwasser at night as a bolus dose, or when we were doing adding buffer, we were typically adding it in the morning because you do your test and your alkalinity was low and you dump in a ton of it. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of what's old is new, which is a lot of things. I mean, a lot of people are switching back to using halides if you can get them. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's what's old is new in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
One of the last topics I think we talked about with Keith was adding trickle filters back onto the tank.
Oh, yeah.
As a way to kick the CO2 out, add more oxygen, and also add another way of adding nitrates into the tank.
So speaking about, you were talking about dosing ammonia and your nitrates dropping, like where are your nitrates kind of sitting now? Because like nitrates at this point are going to be excess that's left over from the conversion process from the ammonia, probably in conjunction with some extra from feeding and whatnot. But like, are you finding your nitrates are like quite low when you test?
If I test, they'll be 1 to 3, and I now try to keep them between 10 and 15 just to prevent that quick drop down because they consume the ammonia so fast. I'm now up to dosing 200 milliliters of ammonia a day to the tank too.
Yeah.
So I've really had to increase the amount of ammonia going in. It's on 10, 20 milliliter every hour for 10 hours of ammonia. Well, actually, no, 40 milliliters right after the bolus dosing and then 20 milliliters every hour after that.
Okay. Yeah, that kind of makes sense. So you want to kind of supply a little bit more during that kind of peak light period.
Yeah, when the lights just blast on, that's when the ammonia blasts on.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know how much that replicates what actually occurs on the reef. I don't know if there's an ammonia spike in the morning when all the fish wake up and probably go to the bath.
Possible. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but that seemingly is what's working in my system. Mm-hmm. I mean, the one caveat I would point out is every system is different. Mm-hmm. What works on mine is different than what works on yours. There is some continuity, but there's a fair amount of disparity between systems. So for everybody out there, find out what works for you and tailor the system to you. You may do 2 doses of bolus. You may do just 1 bolus dose. It all depends on what is working for you.
Yeah. And I mean, with that method, try to not get sneaky and sort of try to hybridize it with some other method and think I can just take this part of this methodology and mix it with kalkwasser or something. Like it's really meant to be a standalone system, which is nice because it's simple, right?
It's very simple, and that's one of the things that we all tend to do. We have our tank doing well, and then we see Joe's tank, and it's fabulous, and he's doing this. Well, I'm going to add this, but he's doing 5 other things that are different that you may or may not know about.
Yeah.
I mean, there aren't any real reef secrets. The secret is find a system that works, stick with it. I mean, I'm someone who's always been experimenting. For the past year and a half, I have cut back on the experimenting. I basically have gone to a system and stuck with it. I mean, obviously,
I have trouble believing that.
A half ago, and the bolus 3 months ago, but nothing really else has changed. I'm not adding different trace elements. I mean, I've been using reef moonshiners now for probably 3 or 4 years now, so that hasn't changed. I mean, things are pretty much stable. I mean, going to bolus was the last big change I made on the tank, and it really has made a difference. The biggest thing I saw also was a significant diminution in the amount of detritus in the tank.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to take out half a pound of dry detritus every 2 weeks on the water change. Now I'm lucky if I get out 100 grams.
This is from since you switched to bolus, you're finding this.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I mean, going to sodium bicarbonate versus sodium carbonate, you just don't get the precipitate.
So you think it's the precipitate that's sort of leading to more detritus buildup in general? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Now that you mention it.
If you take soda ash and mix them up and take a liter of your tank water and pour it in there and take a same amount of sodium bicarbonate and pour in a liter of your tank water, look at what the precipitate is an hour after you've added it. There's a significant difference.
Yeah. There's a video of Claude actually from Fauna Marine doing a little demonstration of that. And you can really see like the flakiness and the precipitation when you put sodium carbonate in tank water. It's quite obvious. So, you're doing that, a dozen times a day with, multiple doses. Like that's just constantly going to be creating, that precipitate, which I guess settles and then bacteria probably, attaches to it. And you kind of get these piles of detritus building up wherever they end up. Right.
Yeah. I mean, in my tank, I have 2 dead spots that I've designed with PVC basically acting as kind of a funnel and funneling all the detritus there. And I used to fill up the bucket when I was taking it out. Now I barely get any out of those 2 dead spots that I've designed for it with the flow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Actually, maybe you'd have something to weigh in on this, because I feel like I'm like my colors and my growth are good. Some corals look really good. Some corals I'm like I know they could be better. So of course I'm still in that mode of trying new things. But it was suggested to me because I've always run a lot of live rock in my sumps, like a cryptic sump with lots of live rock. It was suggested to me to pull out all the rock because the rock is technically it's competing with the corals for that ammonia and nitrogen, by doing, what you originally put the live rock in there for was to convert nitrates, but essentially it's competing with the corals. So what do you think about pulling my live rock out or gradually piece by piece getting it out of the sun?
I have done that to a degree with the only rock I left in was being the rock that had a lot of sponges on it. Mm-hmm. Simply because having started a couple dead rock tanks, the only time the coral started to take off was once the sponges took over. Mm-hmm. So as a result, I kept the sponge rock, but I took out all the other dead rock.
Yeah.
And if I need to use a piece of rock, I simply stood it in there for a week or two. It gets fully colonized again and then put it back in. But the thing that I found is you tend to get a lot of detritus settling there. You tend to get a lot of other organisms growing in that rock that may or may not be beneficial to the tank.
Yeah. Like I've always thought, the more the better. But I think you're right. Like the sponges, I think based on all this DOC discussion that's happening, the sponges seem to be, probably somewhat helpful in that department. So, that could be why that's a good indication of a healthy system is, the sponges are absorbing carbon, right? Probably all the time. Yeah. Yeah. But, the other thing about having rock in a sump, it's almost like the same as not, as having a no sand bed in a system. Like it's another thing that you don't have to consider when you're troubleshooting. You don't have to be like, oh, maybe it's something to do with the sand bed. Maybe it's something to do with the rock. Like if you start taking all those pieces out of a system, then you have less to look at when you're trying to solve problems. If it's just water and corals and a little bit of rock in the display and fish, whatever organisms, you can narrow it down to those simple things for the most part.
Well, 30 years ago, probably 35 years ago now, maybe even longer, a gentleman named Richard Harker built a 700-gallon tank in his basement. And the amount of rock he had was like 50 pounds of rock. And he just put some coral frags on and let the corals be the dominant organism in the tank rather than the live rock. And his corals grew faster than anybody's. I mean, the same thing if you look at Sanjay's tank. The amount of live rock relative to the corals is relatively small. I mean, the corals have totally dominated the tank, and he doesn't have a whole lot of live rock in his sump. He actually took it out a couple of years ago, if I recall correctly. Okay. And so there are examples now of people that no longer have tons of live rock in their sumps. And whether it's beneficial or not, again, for some tanks it may be beneficial, but for other tanks it may be something worth trying to remove from the tank. Yeah. In my own tank, I've only pretty much left the sponge rock. The other junk I took out. And when I did so, the amount of detritus that was trapped in there was kind of amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think maybe I'll try that. But I don't want to do it all at once. I think I'll do, 10% per week for several weeks until it's out and just kind of monitor things because, it's obviously part of the way the system functions. And, I think actually this is sort of anecdotal, but maybe about 6 months ago, I pulled about half the rock out of the sump in my LPS system. And I noticed my nutrients went up like quite a bit in that system. And I didn't think the rock would have that much of an impact. It's like a 400-gallon system. It's loaded with coral. But, that rock was obviously doing more than I thought it was. So, again, it's just something not to do too quickly and just kind of keep an eye on things.
Well, the question is, if you have the rock really stacked on it, you probably get anoxic conditions, which is one of the things that Steve Tyree talked about. And when you have anoxic conditions, that's probably helping your nitrate reduction. That's probably what's helping to keep it low. Yeah. But now that we're dosing ammonia, is that what you want or not? Everything is like plates on a stick. You're too young to remember when there used to be variety shows, when they used to bring on a guy and he would put 50 plates on the sticks and run around and keep them all going. That's pretty much what we're constantly doing on our reef tanks. We're constantly balancing plates on sticks. As we jokingly say, there's always something. There's never a day where you can go by and go, everything's perfect. I can just sit here and relax. There's always, that fell over, or this coral's getting picked on, or something.
Yeah. And another problem I think I'm running into is, corals are just getting too big and too grown in. And some of the corals I don't want to be as big as they are, 10 times larger than I need, and then some of the ones I want to be 10 times bigger are small
that's
still.
always
so,
the case. The,
yeah.
the fastest, ugliest corals. It's the same thing if you have coral deaths in a tank. It's always the most colorful, most expensive ones.
Yeah.
The brown and green ones, they'll live through apocalypse, but the real colorful ones, those are the ones that go first.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think, I mean, multicolor corals, I think there just is more requirement in to produce those pigments, and that would explain some of that. But, it's always, it's like you say, it's like things like the high-end tenuis and speciosas and corals like that, that tend to be the most sensitive to whatever issues may cause them to go sideways on you.
In old days, it used to be Acropora geminifera was the most difficult to keep coral. Now, obviously, it's the speciosas, the biopharas, the tenuis.
Yeah.
But the question is why?
Yeah.
I mean, everybody has them. Why are they still so difficult? You'd figure by now, with literally hundreds of thousands of us keeping them, we would have everything down to a really good system.
Well, it's because we all have a different system. So, and a few people seem to have them really nailed down, but not every, like, especially like you say, the speciosa. Yeah.
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 No, I've had a couple people tell me that we're having difficulty with speciosa before. Now that they're dosing ammonia, they've actually gotten speciosas to encrust when they could barely keep them alive before. So It's probably nutrition. There's probably other factors as well.
Yeah.
So
interesting. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's probably a good tip for people that are having, wanting to try speciosa that, maybe are dosing nitrates right now. Try the ammonia. My experience with the ammonia actually was quite good. Like I stopped nitrates, like I was dosing nitrates, it completely stopped, and I switched right to ammonia, started with a pretty conservative dose, and I just monitored my nitrate level. And eventually my nitrates went back to around where they were when I was dosing nitrates, but it took actually quite a bit of ammonia. But the difference I saw was actually less nuisance algae in the tank. So I think it seems like the corals are better at utilizing the ammonia, but the nuisance algae seems better at utilizing the nitrates when you dose nitrates.
Yeah, there's actually some literature that shows that. And I've also found that dinoflagellates seem to prefer nitrates to ammonia too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because corals need an extra step to break down nitrates to actually utilize them, right? So, But I mean, at the same time, it's still, even if you're not dosing ammonia, it's still probably important to have nitrates and phosphates in that ratio, right? In the 10 to 1 or 100 to 1 kind of ratio.
100 to 1. Yeah. 50 at least, 100 to 1 is even better.
Yeah.
And you have to have some phosphate. I mean, don't go for zero phosphate.
Yeah.
Because corals still need phosphate for energy. ATP is phosphate. So you have to have some. I mean, I try to keep it between 0.05 and 0.15.
Yeah.
And I try to keep the nitrate levels 100 times higher.
Yeah.
But dosing with ammonia means I do more testing.
Yeah.
I mean, I hate testing, but you have to do more if you're doing this.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Keep that in mind. If you start dosing ammonia, figure you're going to be doing tests 3 times a week instead of once a week when you're dosing nitrate.
Yeah. And it seems like the ammonia thing makes sense more for like a heavily stocked system or a system that's a bit more mature. Yeah. Maybe not like a newbie system. Yeah. Yeah. Because then you're just putting ammonia in that, could affect the fish and whatnot and will not get used by the corals particularly.
Yeah, the only time I had issues when I first started doing it, and I'm thinking, I missed a day, so I added 1 big bolus dose, and then I lost 2 big angelfish. They did not tolerate a high dose of ammonia. Mm-hmm. Everything else was fine. Next day it was fine, but that's the one time I did a big bolus dose. So don't bolus dose the ammonia. Don't confuse that with bolus dose.
The
alkalinity.
Sure. Yeah. So like over the years, so what are some other changes you think you've made where you switched a system over, like say from when you had been doing calcium reactor or something, or maybe when you changed to moonshiners? Is there anything you could say like you really, really think was like a really good positive change for your system?
One of them was opening up the live rock, where I used to have live rock packed on live rock packed on live rock. And when I switched over to using fiberglass rods and opening it up, I got the fish to be out more because there were more hiding places. Fish can't really hide when you have 2 pieces of live rock like this.
Yeah.
But when you have it open, they know there's hiding places, so they came out more. And it also allowed for less of the detritus to accumulate in certain spots. So opening up the tank and having the live rock used less, but used in a better manner.
Yeah, you're basically utilizing your 3 dimensions better. You almost, in the old school was more of a 2-dimension. And I think, a good example is also Top Shelf Aquatics, the way they keep their frag systems. It's actually multi-level sort of pillars of PVC where the corals are kind of like completely spaced out well, I mean, they're spaced out, but they're also like, there's all of those dimensions are open around them. So
Yeah.
yeah.
The other big change I made it through probably 2 or 3 months ago, where I took off 13 different power heads. I mean, I had power heads everywhere in the tank, and I went to 2 big Abyss pumps that are right across from each other and on random flow up to 80%. And the amount of current that now blows within the tank, I mean, sometimes they're both at 10%. It looks like there's nothing going on in the tank. But every now and then they'll both be at 80%, and it's like a wave sitting in the middle of the tank, and everything gets washed clean. I mean, the biggest problem is still finding a good adhesive to mount everything solidly.
Really?
But that has been one of the biggest things I've done is improvement of the flow, so it's random throughout the entire tank.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So the way you set these Abyss up, are they returns or a closed loop, or are they actually an internal pump?
They're both internal. They're water cannons. They're probably 10 inches long and probably 4 or 5, maybe 6 inches in diameter. I mean, they stand out. But the thing is, whenever you have 13 power heads, I notice those far more than I do these things.
Yeah. Yeah. And 13 power heads is more maintenance and liability too. Like, you're dealing with maintaining those 13 units as opposed to 2. So that's probably made your life easier.
2 months. Yeah, some were gyres. Those had to come out every 3 months and be cleaned.
Yeah.
Some were MP60s. Those always had to be, the intakes had to be cleaned because they drew in so much. There was the two other things, it literally dropped the temperature of the tank 3 degrees. I mean, which was great in the summer. In the fall, it keeps it at 77, but in the summertime, I had a tough time keeping it under 81. Now it's no problem. It stays 77 all the time, so I have much more stability there. The other thing that amazes me is I'm now saving $150 a month in electricity.
That's crazy.
I didn't
That's
realize
huge.
how much power these units, for how much water they move, is only 100 watts each.
Yeah.
So they're not using a whole lot of power. Whenever you have 13 that are using a fair amount of electricity, that's saving $150 a month. I mean, in 2 years, these will basically pay for themselves. They're not inexpensive, obviously, but what they've done, I'm quite impressed with. I mean, if you have a big tank, I would seriously look at switching over to these versus running that many power heads.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll put a link in the description of the episode here because I need to look them up myself. So, that's pretty cool. I mean, my systems are more like flat, big, wide frag systems, so it may not be the right application for mine. Like, I think the gyres are a good choice, but I think you're right.
The gyres are perfect for that, but for a big tank, it's 3-dimensional where you have dead spaces. I mean, now I can watch the anemones move about. There's certain holes in the live rock that basically are blasted clean a couple times a day, so I don't have anything settling in there. Like I said, the only thing you have to worry about is you can easily turn them off, and then you have to mount stuff and make sure it's firmly mounted.
Yeah, crazy.
And settles in for half an hour before you turn the pumps back on.
Yeah. I think there's something to that too. Is like you say, it gets quite calm and then it gets quite strong. It's not like maybe I'm a little bit guilty with my flow of having it. There's always at least one gyre that's like hitting 100% for a while. Yeah. It's maybe I'm getting a little bit too much constant flow, and I think maybe corals do need a little bit of a break sometimes. Yeah. Maybe compared to the ocean.
What's interesting is watching how the fish have adapted to it, because I was worried that the fish would get sucked onto these. That hasn't happened at all. And you can watch the fish when certain currents are on. They'll literally like swim with it, and it's like a game for them.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to watch.
Yeah.
It's much more, to my eye, having been on reefs, it's much more like the reefs are in terms of the flow being random and strong, rather than its laminar flow from power heads. Even gyres wise, it's much superior in my mind.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's a thing for people to look into for sure. Just final question. I'll let you go soon. There's lots of good stuff. Anything you would attribute to corals having like a metallic sheen or some of that metallic kind of pigmentation? Would you say that's more to do with trace elements?
I'd say trace elements have brought those out more than was occurring before. In talking with a lot of different people, it seems chromium, cobalt, copper, and iron seem to be the trace elements that seem to have an effect on those.
Yeah.
I mean, on a lot of ICP tests, you'll get a 0 reading, but you need to have some of those in your tank. You need to dose some of it, in my opinion. And I also talked to a lot of other people that are keeping tenuous and other more difficult to keep corals, and they've all found that adding those seem to make a significant improvement in the tank.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've probably seen an improvement since switching to moonshiners and paying more attention to those elements. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it does seem like it's kind of a amalgamation of all of those elements being in their ranges. You can't really attribute it to one in specific. It's like, they all work together to kind of help these processes fire properly in the coral's pigmentation.
Yeah, that's one of the things I really like about the Fauna Marin ICP test is he doesn't just show single trace elements and their levels. Yeah. He actually shows the ratios between them and how they interact and how they should be.
Yeah.
So that if you have 4 trace elements all in a line and you have one way off, that's what's throwing things off. That's what you have to adjust rather than, okay, this one, because if the ratios are all high, they're in balance. But if one's off, that's when you need to adjust it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's a great ICP, and that's why I use them and advise on them. And actually, it'll be interesting to see because they're going to add MS as an add-on to their ICP because some elements are going to be a little bit better to detect in those high detailed detection ranges. So some of those metals you mentioned actually. So it's going to be good.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what having that finer range does. Do we get even better at doing things?
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe we just get a little...
Because ICP's been out now 11 years, and for the first 6 or 7 years, I can honestly say I don't think it made that significant of a difference as much as it has in the past 5 years.
Yeah. Maybe there's a lot is improving around it. A lot knowledge of the actual elements, but like you say, the ratios are something that we're understanding better too. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that goes. And I don't know what I'm going to try this year because I've been experimenting, but. I do feel like my corals just have a look to them. Like there's almost like a trademark to the way my corals look. And I feel like that with a lot of other tanks I look at. Like if I have certain friends that whatever, this specific coral just has this kind of look in their tank. And, I don't know. I find it hard to really notice a super discernible change in my system. And again, it's like I'm not going to do anything crazy and do something rapid, but I'd like to see something change just to know like, okay, like it's possible to reinvent the way your tank looks, but how do you do it safely?
It is. No, it definitely is. I mean, I'm old school, and I remember the beautiful corals that came from Fiji, which have been gone for the last 5 or 6 years. Now some of the really nice ones are coming back in, like the geminiferas, like I mentioned.
Yeah.
Some really nice humulus. I mean, turquoise and blues. I mean, I still like blue corals. I run halides for 3 hours a day on my tank. I really like how the deep blues and purples look on the tank. Once those kick off and the LEDs switch over to the blue mode, they're washed out and you don't see them. But for the morning when the bolus kicks in and the halides and all the bright lights are on white, they really stand out.
Yeah, totally.
There's something for everyone. But like you said, I agree with you, though. Corals morph to the environment that they're in. You and I and 5 other people can have the same coral. It will look different pretty much in every one of our tanks to some degree.
Yeah.
You could move a coral 2-inch distance from another coral. Same coral, it looks completely different 2 inches away.
Yeah, I've seen that too, for sure. It's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw that in Jason Fox's tanks.
Yeah.
One time I visited and he had 2 home wreckers and they were 2 inches apart, and you could tell they were both home wreckers, but the coloration on them was significantly different, just 2 inches apart in the same water.
Crazy. My next guest is John Yull from Reefworks Corals. You can check out his site at reefworkscorals.com. You can also find him at a lot of the major US coral shows selling his amazing corals, so definitely check it out and say hi. Talking about a reef tank hitting a bit of a plateau, maybe kind of, let's say old tank syndrome, or, maybe you've just kind of gotten to a point with the reef where your coloration and your growth is kind of like it's good, but it's not like, there's another level. And, what are some of the things somebody might try or some things that you've tried in the past that you feel like you've really seen like a significant improvement from?
Yeah. So initially, like what I would say is, starting with an ICP, like going through that first and seeing if there's anything underlying that's really off with the system. That's one of the ones. And then of course salinity is the one, where I'm always like checking that with people. But, going through the things of possibly hitting a lot, several water changes too, just to see if there's something in there, like the DOC, where people are kind of figuring that out now, where, going through that.
Well, it's helpful also, like you say, with ICP, if you have one from a time when the tank was doing really well,
exactly,
as a reference point. But I mean, for me, something I'm experiencing, and I think it's in my farm systems, is just I have so many big colonies that are just growing into each other and competing so much. Like, I think my system was better when there was half as much coral in there, even though I didn't do anything particularly differently.
Right. And what I find, like, I'll be looking at my stuff, and I've got these huge colonies of like the leader or something, and I'm like, I'm never going to sell that. And what am I going to do with it? But I'm first and foremost, I always say, like, the hobbyist, where it's like, that's cool that it's that big.
Yeah.
But then you've got like the other issues of that with around flow, and then it just sucking up so much stuff and doing that, where, you could just be kind of thinning that out and letting flow hit stuff better. And, I'm sure, like you, now I get into a point where I'm like, they're hitting each other and one's growing over the other, but what do I do?
Yeah, and the coral grows faster than its demand for making frags from it.
Most
too.
definitely.
So,
Except the certain few that you're like, I need 5 colonies of this, growing. But a lot of the things, it's just. But then it's cool when they look like that, and you get to see a full colony.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm still a hobbyist. Like, I still just enjoy looking at my corals and kind of enjoying the shape and the size of them and whatnot. But but back to the sort of ICP thing. I mean, I guess if it's someone that hasn't done one often or for quite a while, that's maybe like a good place to start. But you've ventured pretty heavy into doing the moonshiners method. Which is like a lot of daily dosing and really like doing these regular ICPs and making your adjustments. Like, was that a big turning point for you would say?
I believe so. Like, I've really noticed coloration, like a lot of people ask me, like, why do you have so much PE? And I really put most of that down to that, doing the moonshiners and doing the dosing and really trying to just do that and not do it. Like, my thing is, like, I don't do corrections. I just up and down my dose, my daily dose every month from my ICP. And therefore, I'm really not shocking things around or doing anything crazy with it. Yeah. I think that's first and foremost for me is keeping it as flatline and stable. And as I always say, that you don't need to hurry to a point. Like, if it takes 2 months, 3 months to get up, if you're putting it in, it's getting used and it's doing its thing.
Yeah.
Corals are using it, and then eventually it'll be a slow increase up to where you really want it to be.
Yeah.
I think that's huge.
Yeah, and something to keep in mind, if a level has dropped on something, it's probably dropped gradually over time. So why increase it quickly? If it dropped that fast or that slowly, then you want to increase it that slowly, potentially. I mean, for the most part, nothing good happens fast in a reef tank.
I was about to say that exact thing, where I was going to pull that one out right now. And I say that way more to people that are asking my advice all the time. And I'm like, don't do anything fast. Or it's like, my pH is low, so I've just started doing 1,000 mLs of corkbuster or something. I'm like, stop. Do 100. Do 200 next week, do 300 the week, and then build it up slowly, because a change from, another one that I would say, a change from bad to good isn't necessarily good for your tank. If it's in a bad point, and you quickly go to a good point, you can have a lot of issues there, like burning things or just stressing them out, It makes a big difference.
The other question too is, like, how fast do things change to be perceivable? Like, how fast is a change really? Like, for me, it's kind of like I'll come into the garage one day and I'll be like, I think things look a little bit more vibrant today, maybe just a little bit better, but it's hard to say. It's more like, if you're ever away for a vacation for a week, then you come back and you're like, oh, my corals look better, or they look a little paler now. You might sort of notice it more, but it's hard to sort of quantify the direction a system's going in. And especially say if you have corals that are struggling, you're trying to make changes to kind of like set them in a good direction where you're improving their health. But oftentimes they may get worse, and you may lose those pieces if you can't figure out what the thing was that caused them to get that way in the first place.
Right.
Yeah.
I just had one where, like, one day I walk in and things just aren't as vibrant. Like, I mean, as you know, like we're looking at this stuff every day. So it's like if one colony changes its color slightly, like I'm like, what's going on? And what I put it down to was that the winter's kind of, a little bit cooler here, and my temperature in my tank was up to 78, and I run at 76, and I got it back down to 76, and like 2 weeks later, everything looks fine again. And I think, especially maybe with so much coral and the way we have those tanks, that has a big part to play in it.
Yeah.
And keeping it pretty accurate. Like that's the other one. It's like overnight it swings up and then swings down, and trying to keep that kind of like the moonshiners, where it's like keeping it in line and keeping it nice is the difference. But that's all I could put it down to, because nothing else had changed.
Yeah. It's that's just kind of that sense we have that's just kind of this doesn't look quite as good today or whatever. Yeah.
A good one, Andrew, that you had on for Portland, Bowerman. I talked to him, and he was saying if you can keep your tank at 76, you run into a lot less type Vibrio type things, or like the bacteria wise, like keeping it cooler. So I'm kind of hitting that 75, 76.
Okay. Yeah. So, maybe to make it more applicable, because we're kind of coral farmers and we have these heavily stocked systems, but there may be somebody that's at a stage that, their tank's a year old and they have a bunch of, frags / mini colonies, but things are just not totally taking off for growth and color. What are some of the things you would look at? I think, like you say, ICP, checking some of those minor and trace elements. But
stability and alk, stability and alk is key as well. I think that's way up there, and pH, like trying to get those two within a range and not swinging a whole bunch. And
one of the things I would probably ask about immediately with someone in that case is, what the nutrient and the sort of nutrition in the system is.
Yes.
Often that can kind of be either too much or not enough. I mean, anything in the reef hobby can be kind of reduced to those terms, but often those, younger tanks, it's like there's not as much biology happening because there's less coral volume per gallon. There's just not as many organisms. So, it's nice once you hit that sweet spot and you start to have some bigger colonies.
I think a year, I'm sure you're the same. Like my 600, when I rebooted it, and then lost everything in the freeze, and then kind of was left with frags and coming back from there. It took a year, like almost to the day, of it turning around and things really taking off and coloring up and starting to pee and starting to do well. Like I remember going like, and I started, which I know you have also talked, like I started with dry rock, and I don't think I'd ever do that again.
Yeah.
Like that was not good. Well, so that took a whole year.
What was the reason for the reset in the first place?
So I had the 10-foot tank, and everything was getting, like I had like a lot of Montes and things that had just gotten to be like 18 inches. And it was just getting to the point where like you were wasting space, and then all the rock work was loose. So I would like frag something and things would start falling, or because I had set it up really quickly, like for a client needed space. So then I just kept it rolling after that. And then the main one is I got those green Mahanos in there.
Yeah.
And they were everywhere. And I tried to fight it. And to that point was like, I gave up, and then I wanted to redo the rock, and then I wanted to do the plumbing because I'd rushed that, and I redid a sump and kind of did it the way I wanted it to go.
Yeah.
So like my tank now has a tunnel the entire 10-foot length down the middle of the rock. So I just put power heads blasting the whole way down underneath because there's so much rock in there.
Well, your corals are looking really good lately. I mean, the photos and videos, I'll take a little credit for the photos because I gave you some help with your camera, but no, your corals are looking amazing right now. So.
Yeah. Well, and of course, I got to buy another one of those cameras now. After
that's right. You said it. Yeah. Waterproof camera in quotes. Yeah. And
I think anybody that tells you everything is roses all the time, like between my two systems, well, three systems, there's always one of them that's slightly ahead of the other one. And I feel like it's just not there, and then it peaks up, and the other one will kind of dip a little bit, and like say with the temperature or something, where you're like nobody else would notice, but I can tell exactly that something's just not perfectly on, and I don't really know an answer to what makes it do that besides it's going through its natural things. But I do really believe, like, when you see something, like when I see something like that, like I'll just do some 50, 100-gallon water changes, and then, which is a percentage, like they're 800-gallon systems. So, just weekly, like, try and get some new water in there, and I'll see things turn around just from that. So that is another one. If people are having issues and especially if they're doing the shine or something and not doing water changes, that I really think, like, just getting some fresh water in there and getting things moving makes a big difference. I'm all for that. I do a daily water change, but it's still like I'll just knock out some water.
Is it just automated? Like you have like 5 gallons or something? Yeah.
It does 10 gallons a day.
Yeah.
Yeah, 10 gallons a day on the Apex.
Yeah, okay.
So,
that's interesting. I mean, I had talked to a few people recently that seemed to be having good results with small, regular water changes.
Yeah.
And, it's something I always thought was like, oh, it's not going to do anything. You're just, changing this tiny little bit. But it does
But I also
seem to
go
be
through,
good. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I go through 5 boxes of salt a week. So for me to do 150 gallons on my systems is not a big deal.
Yeah.
And then my quarantine, the wastewater from the big tank goes to the quarantine, and then another dose pulls it out of the quarantine.
Okay.
So that's actually getting a water change from the systems.
Okay. Yeah.
But I do find then that the nitrates creep up because you have nitrates from the big tank plus whatever's in the quarantine tank. So,
okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I guess another thing some people might change every once in a while, and I'm considering this, is your major element sources, like it's either going to be, I mean, for most cases, it's going to be calcium reactor, calc, or like a 2-part kind of, or 3-part, whatever equivalent. Some people are doing 1 parts, but let's maybe exclude that for for this purpose. But I've considered pulling my calcium reactor off because it's like, it is a little bit of an ancient kind of style of providing major elements. But my concern is that there's phosphate in that media, and that phosphate is part of what makes my system run the way it is. Like there's a certain amount of phosphate coming out of there that's keeping my phosphates sitting around 0.1, which is around where I like them. So, I'm a little bit scared to just pull that off and change it,
Yeah. I'm so anti calcium reactor that because from the maintenance side of things, it would never work when I get back to it like a week later or 2 weeks later. Yeah. So I've always done 3-part, well, on my system's 3-part, my clients are all 2-part, and it's all Trident dosed. And I go through that with a thing, which I know we've talked about before. And I still do the caulk on there too. So I've done stupid things, like I'll watch my alk dropping, and then I'd get home and I filled it up and didn't put the tube back in, but knowing that the caulk's going at the same time, then I'm at least not dropping as fast as I was. So I like to do that.
And what is your 2-part again? What are you using for that?
I buy Fritz. Fritz sell like 35-pound buckets of, basically. And then I do, for my alk, I do, for a 5-gallon jug, I do 4 pounds of carbonate and 1 pound of bicarb in there. And then calcium chloride on the calcium carbonate on the calcium side of it. Yeah. And then I buy BRS's magnesium. Yeah. And they do 2-part maintenance mix for that.
Okay.
So.
Yeah. I actually thought about, I know that most magnesium mixes are magnesium sulfate and magnesium chloride. Yeah. Because a lot of tanks are actually deficient in sulfate, I've been thinking I should probably just be actually dosing magnesium sulfate. I don't know who, if many people have tried that, but I think generally the ratio is actually more magnesium chloride. But
I believe so.
But
the flake, right? Which is the flake. That's that's the one.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to just be able to use Epsom salts from the, farmer grade from the grocery store, but I don't know if I trust that. I mean, I think it's such a mass-produced product that it's meant to go in your bath. It's not.
Yes, exactly. I don't know whether I would trust that, but like say, I used to do Fritz made one, but it ended up being, when you do the measurement on it, it's like 5 pounds. No, it was like 15 pounds per 5-gallon jug.
Wow.
Like, to get it, and I'm like. And it would never really mix well or do anything. So I just buy that, put it in a gallon, and then dose it. And it's way less than I'm dosing, but it keeps me at 1350, in that area. And I notice more Caroline. I notice more stuff like that going on with doing that. So
yeah, nice.
And then fluoride. I mean, that's the other one to me that's huge.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
also be very careful with any of those things.
Yeah.
Which is back to the corrections, because I feel like people that just take, it's like add 500 mLs 5 days in a row, and it's like now you're going up to that over 1.5 probably. And then it's coming down and looks good on your ICP. But in between that, like, where were you?
Yeah. And it's also, that's if you're 100% trusting the result that you're getting on your ICP.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
I mean, by the time you get your result, your tank could have changed. There could be some discrepancies in the ICP.
Right.
There's always some room for some kind of variability. So,
exactly. Yeah. Nothing ever is that way. Like, I mean, that's what worries me is like, every system's different, and how is the uptake of each one of those elements? Because, like my fluoride and manganese are insane how much I'm using. But other things like iodine, one of my tanks, the big tank, like is high, and I never add it. So I don't know what element, like where that's coming from.
Yeah.
But the other one is like 5 drops in 800 gallons every day.
so little, like almost nothing.
I'm like, when people are like, I have to dose it, I'm like, I don't know where mine's coming from or what it is, but I don't have to do it.
Well, I mean, it's something to also consider is like, what are your inputs and your outputs on every tank? Because, that's going to be the other thing determining. A lot of people think your trace elements are coming often from your water changes, and obviously they'll come from your 2-part if you're doing trace, or your, trace element system you're adding. But, a lot of trace elements are coming from the food that you're feeding, whether that be coral food, fish food, nori, maybe that's
for my phosphates.
Well, apparently nori I think nori has iodine in it. So if you have more tangs in that tank, maybe you're feeding more nori, and that could be the reason. Like, it could be just some just looking at your inputs and understanding.
I think it's the spectrum. I do the spectrum pellets just because I use so much of that for clients too. And I really think that my phosphates and other certain things are coming out of that for sure. Because I have to use I hate doing it, but if I don't run GFO every week, like a small amount, like a cup, then my phosphates will, like, sometimes I'll test it and be like 0.3, and I'm like, oh, well.
Oh, crazy.
And that's between...
Okay. Huh.
On a weekly kind of basis. Like I test every Sunday, and then I'll do GFO, and I run between 0.1 if I'm lucky, up to like 0.2 sometimes, and then I know it'll be going down when I do the GFO, and then when I test again, I'm kind of back up. But that's my biggest, like, when people, like, I know I listen to you and you're like, it's really low, and I'm like, but it's always been that way in my tank. So I really probably do put that down to that pellet food.
Yeah. And that's, that's another thing that kind of comes back to this conversation is like, every tank kind of has like its unique profile of like where it wants to sit. And like your phosphates want to sit higher. You don't really know exactly why.
Always has. Yeah.
And it's like, and that works for your tank. I mean, sure, you have to do the GFO to kind of keep it somewhat in line, but like, there's something to be said
just let
for
it
that.
Roll,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, there is a certain point that what we do, we have to just kind of like accept certain things about your system and not chase other people's ideas. And I guess that should come down to most of what we're talking about is like when you see somebody or that you ask somebody what they do, that's not going to work for your tank, and it will work for different tanks in different ways. I can set up 2 tanks for clients exactly the same, and one will be kicking ass and one will just be struggling a year later. And nothing different that I do, or nothing different in the setup. So I just go, okay, well, this one's going to have higher phosphate than this one, and the nitrates just stick pretty much exactly where they are all the time. I did start doing the ammonia just recently. Okay. I'm just on one of the tanks and see.
This is one of your systems or our client system?
Yeah, one of my systems.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just
put like 10 mils a day or something in 800.
My next guest is Dmitry Tumanov from Treasure Corals. He has a great YouTube channel. He's a great content creator. So definitely go on over to Treasure Corals and check his stuff out. He also built an app called Aquatic Log, which I use for logging my aquarium. It's a really great logging app, and it's definitely worth the yearly fee. So I highly recommend that as well. You have done some resets in the last couple of years. You've had a lot of tanks over the years that you've grown to mature reef. What were some of the reasons that you kind of decided to do like a reset, and like what were some of the problems you were running into that made you want to do that?
Well, the most obvious, and I think the one that a lot of people can relate, is the best part of having a tank is the build. I've interviewed a lot of folks for my channel, and I hear that at least from half of the folks, and a lot of people actually lose interest to the tanks. I never lose interest, but that feeling when you have a brand new tank and you have the sand, and now you've done the rock work, and then you're adding the water, and the first 2-3 months of introducing the fish and coral and all of that, I think this is probably the 90% of the enjoyment, at least for me. So I do like that a lot.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, a lot of people do enjoy the early phases, but also the early phases comes with more challenges and probably more maintenance.
It does, but lately I think there was a big paradigm shift in the hobby, because I remember watching the BRS videos where they would set up a tank, and then for 4 months it would just be live rock and maybe 1 or 2 fish, and before they would add the corals, and that was the big deal 10 years ago. But now I think it's the opposite. I've many times introduced coral on day 1, well, before the spike of ammonia and nitrate. And if anything, the results were phenomenal. I mean, they like the ammonia, they like the nitrate and all of that stuff. And you actually get the benefits on day 1.
Yeah. Okay. So what kind of coral volume were you adding right away, as far as I don't know. It's hard to kind of quantify like a coral per gallon kind of thing, but are we saying 40 or 50 pieces in a, what is your tank, 250 gallons or something?
Well, this one is 250 to close to 300. It's a 7-footer. Now that tank is a little bit different, because I wouldn't do that on a tank where there would be no live rock. I actually had the established live rock and corals in 2 other aquariums. So I had a 5-footer and a 4-footer, and I've put them together. And I basically did that on day 1. So I've put the tank in, and then I immediately combined 2 other tanks, and I threw the fish in, and I had pretty much no spike of anything. For the first month, I was concerned a little bit, and maybe I didn't feed as much, and had the lights a little bit lower. But then no diatom phase, nothing. I had no cycle.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. I mean, I've always found that, when you transfer a system, there's some kind of cycle usually on the glass, because you don't have those biofilms established. You kind of found that was generally okay?
No, I've used a lot of biomedia. I've also moved all the media in the sump. So technically, the only thing that was different, it was maybe a 50% water change, so I reused a lot of water. So the sand was different. It was brand new sand. And to your point, the glass surfaces were empty, so no bacteria. Other than that, everything else was established.
Yeah. And so what were some of the other reasons for sort of wanting to do a reset? I mean, I do find that, at a certain point, a reef just gets filled in, and you kind of have the corals you have, but you can't really add anything else. Was it kind of something like that for you?
Well, I was trying to simplify things. This was a great opportunity to go bigger, but combine multiple tanks into one. So that would be the number one reason. Another thing is I was at that time enamored by some of the bigger fish. So I was really wanted to try the Sohal tank and some of the others. I was very inspired by some of the Instagrams and YouTube videos out there. And also this is an opportunity to do things better, to do things a little bit different, maybe change up the aquascape or get rid of the corals that you no longer maybe find as fascinating, and maybe focus on things that you like the best. So I find, as with anything else, the more iterative approach you have, there's always something that you can improve upon from previous things.
Yeah. And your taste in corals might change a little bit. And then you'll also realize, I'm not going to put pink Cadillac in the new tank. That just grows too fast and, takes over a little bit too fast. But maybe it's a good coral to start with, like you're saying, because, then it will fill in, and then you can porch it later if you don't want it anymore. But,
Yeah. And, pink Cadillac still, I have a soft spot for it. But before I went on that journey, I think it was a big thing in 2024. A lot of people were doing reboots, and a lot of people were thinking of other ways of looking at the tank, which is kind of, I think, the theme of this discussion. And part of me wanted to do almost like a biotope or something a little bit simpler, maybe just a certain level of the same corals, very similar corals, as opposed to having like a fixed, mixed reef of Euphilia and SPS and whatnot, or just going straight SPS. Maybe zeroing in on a particular type of coral and just having a lot more of that particular species, as well as simplifying the fish selection. That was the dream. I ended up kind of repeating what I've always done for whatever reason. So
that's fair. Yeah. Something funny too with like a grown out reef. If somebody gets to a point, and I've seen this with tanks that have been shut down, where somebody had been adding a lot of corals from, say, everybody had a lot of these corals 4 or 5 years ago, and then their tank ends up being like this time capsule of corals that were from 5 years ago. And some of them are great, but some of them are like, oh, we're not really growing those anymore. Those are kind of weeds, or there's better versions of that same kind of coral. So why don't you have that one instead? So that's another thing I think that happens. But, the last time I visited you in Toronto, it seemed like your main display was like kind of had hit its max, right?
Yes. And I don't know if you've seen on my channel, Treasure Corals, there is a video I shot. It was a second video of a guy named Carl. And he's got, first of all, best dimensions ever. It's a 4 by 5 foot aquarium, which is kind of peninsula. And the 5 feet is the side, is like a middle view, so you can actually see that depth. But the term that he used in the last video was manicured coral. So everything is a nice colony, but he doesn't let it grow more than, let's say, my fist kind of thing. So this allows you to have 40 corals on just a piece of rock, so probably 150 colonies all in all. But they're all the same size, which I find now, like aesthetically, it's a lot nicer than what's right now. I have like this big green slimer coming from the back, and like at some point I'm just gonna trim it.
So I guess, I mean, one problem I could see with what you're saying is that eventually some of the base encrustation is gonna start to compete a little bit. But I guess he must be kind of treating the SPS specifically a bit more like a bonsai garden or something, where you're just constantly trimming little branches that are getting close. It's a lot of regular maintenance, but I kind of see your point in not letting anything get into super colony size.
Yes.
Yeah.
He also does pegging, so everything is on those little pegs. So a lot of folks do this in the hobby. So you have a lot of holes that are drilled, and then you have I think 1/4 inch or 1/8 rod just sticking in, and then this allows solving that encrusting problem. So you can just reach out down, pick up a coral, and especially if you go higher end coral, they're gonna grow a lot slower. And let's say if you actually have to trim it, it's a good problem to have.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. Yeah, I mean, for me as a coral farmer, I don't really have a display, so I'm not so much looking at ever really doing a reset, but I do get to a point where my colonies get too big, and I kind of go like, I don't need a 2-foot colony of Reef Raft rainbow loom, So, it's tough to know what to do at that point. And I do think that, as your colonies get too big, everything's competing for all of these minor trace elements and, all the elements that really they need, and nutrition. And, you just start to see some of the other corals fade a little bit as these other ones get bigger. And there's these, constant competition. I think some corals are better at taking in nutrients, or maybe they're better at, I don't know, surviving in conditions that are less ideal. So those ones will continue to grow, whereas maybe some of your higher end, more finicky corals might struggle a little bit. So I'm just trying to decide what to do right now, because I have too much coral, more than I can sell.
What is the solution then? What do you think?
Yeah, it's like, do you set up more tanks? I don't think so. I mean, at a certain point, it's like, do I just take a 3 or 4 inch colony of that rainbow loom and get rid of the rest? Because at a certain point, it's basically costing me money to grow that coral. It's taking up valuable real estate on my racks. So literally, I'm paying money to keep that coral.
So I can certainly relate, because I also have a farm, and the problem that you describe is exactly kind of what's going through my head. There's just so many things that probably no longer everybody else has them, and they have them in their aquariums, that it uses up a lot of alk and space. And I'm probably going to have to start tossing or just kind of giving it away. Yeah. First of all, one observation is everybody has kind of the same selection of fish. from one tank to another. If you watch any videos, everybody has kind of a yellow tank, a Nassau tank, Desjardins, and some chromis and maybe some anthias and whatnot. Like everybody has the same.
And a few other odds and ends,
Yeah.
but generally that's for sure.
But my thinking for the new tank, if I wasn't attached to the existing fish, I would probably not, even on a 7-foot tank, I would not put any large fish going forward. I would have gone with maybe 3 or 4 smaller tanks, like a bristle tooth and whatnot, and then the rest would be small fish. So the scale of this whole thing would be completely different. So my vision is manicured corals, so small colonies, kind of on those little pegs and just kind of going in there, and then smaller fish, the cardinals and the anthias and chromis, but something that would give you that completely different scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the fish are more in scale with the size of the colonies. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, interesting. So I guess something just else I'm curious about since your reset, and you've kind of had 2 new systems in the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
Have you found that once you kind of, I mean, you reach established point pretty fast with those tanks, like you're saying, but did you find that you got better coloration and growth than your previous system once you kind of maybe hit that kind of stride of the tank, like with a fresher glass, cleaner, as a cleaner start?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know that when I started out my farm, it took about a year and a half before my acros started to really color up. So for whatever reason, and I've done the same thing. I reuse some live rock and everything else, but there's just something about the balance of probably bacteria and other things where more finicky acros were just not taking it for over a year. With this tank, I would say the first probably 3-4 months were primarily just focusing on the health, less on the color, and I haven't really lost anything from that perspective. But now the colors are really starting to come through, and the main challenge is just finding that par that is good for SPS to bring out the best color, but also not, pissing off the Aikens and Trackies of the world. Yeah, for sure. Well,
I'll put some links in the description of this episode to your system and whatnot, so people can take a look. But what were you running for lighting again? Are you running AI blades and radions?
Well, I listened to your last podcast and episode, and you asked about the blades. So I was the first person, I think, in Canada to review the blades, and I've had them on 3 different systems solely. So I have a full SPS system, full lagoon system, and then now it's a mixed reef. And I only use blades. And I have the radios on my farm, so I can compare. And actually, I had some systems plumbed in. My display tank was plumbed into the same farm, so I could compare the 2. I'm so team blade now that on this big system, I'm just running 6 of them. I'm using both grow and glow, although if I were to choose, I'd say grow all the time. Like, this is kind of probably the best lighting I've ever used. It's absolutely silent. I like the look of it. It's very easy to kind of position, not going back. Yeah, cool. I mean, it seems like a good light from a farming perspective too. I picked up a couple of them for my new build, and I'll see where I go from there. I'm not really sure. I did go with the grows and not the glows, as much as I was tempted for the glows. But I figured if I'm already running radions, then I'm not trying to supplement more blue. I'm just trying to extend what's already there. Yeah, hopefully I made the right choice. I'll find out soon. The tank's ready to go. So, yeah. Something in my experience, moving a system from my old location into new tanks that were delivered at the new Frag garage. Once I got through the initial kind of, there was a little bit of a cycle on the glass. But once I got through that, like, my corals actually looked amazing around that time. Like, around about a month after the move, things looked absolutely awesome. So there is something to that reset, I think, that, kind of, I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's just a bunch of new water. I think it's also, I don't know, like, one thing we don't do very often is clean, like, we'll clean our sumps, but how often do we acid clean our sumps right down to the, I don't know, like, is there benefit in that, or are you killing some of the surface bacteria that you kind of need for the system? That's a tough one. I remember Tidal Gardens. He was had this idea of doing splitting the whole farm into 12 systems or 12 sections, and then doing a full reboot once per month of one of those sections for the pest control, but also kind of doing the acid wash. My anecdotal experience was that sometimes it's just some sort of a how stars arrange, because I had one tank where it was a quarantine tank that I've just put up, and I put in some corals, really nice SPS corals. And for whatever reason, I hit that sweet spot where within a month, it was exactly what you were describing, where my colors were better in that little quarantine system than they were in my farm. But I could not reproduce it in the other ones. So I think there's so many things we just don't know. And I think a lot of it probably is bacteria / microbiome related.
Yeah, that was an interesting takeaway from my chat with Andy Bauma about some of the things he tried with his microbiome testing to kind of figure out what helped support those good waterborne strains of bacteria. And it was actually doing water changes that allowed for those strains to actually take more of a prominent ratio of those families. So I thought that was interesting, because you'd think by taking water out and adding water that is bacteria deficient, you'd actually be you'd be just adding blank water. But I guess it's giving more of an opportunity for some of the good guy bacteria to kind of take hold. So maybe that could have been part of what in those examples kind of worked for both of us.
It's possible, but we have no means of, even in your episode, I think you guys have talked about it, we have no means of necessarily being able to change it or like play God when it comes to that. So even if you know that something's off, other than hopefully going to an established system and taking your live rock that's been there for 5 years and putting them in and hoping that they're going to spread, the rest I think is very isolated approach. So you start putting a couple of strains of bacteria, but it's an orchestra. It's a symphony in of itself.
Yeah, you're affecting all of the ratios of everything. It's not just whatever. Yeah, totally, for sure. Are there any other things you could say you've changed or applied over the years where you think you saw like a really direct result of a positive change from?
Yes, I would say, and again, it's all documented. So about 2 years ago, I was on a streak where every month or 2 months on my YouTube channel, I would try to take whatever the latest coral food, or maybe amino or trace element, and I was just kind of trying to run with it without changing any other parameters. And most of the time, I did not really get anywhere. But the one that brought the biggest change where at some point I said, okay, I'm going to stop everything. And I stopped dosing anything, and I just increased the water changes like double what I was doing. So I was maybe doing 30% a month easy of a water change. And I can tell you 2 months of that, when I came back and I looked at the coral, I could not believe my eyes. So that sometimes simpler is better. And
so this is when you stopped feeding these coral foods? You're just like, stop feeding coral foods, double your water changes.
Stop doing this, stopped going off of those trace bottles, whatever it was. Now, mind you, I didn't do the moonshiner. That was even before that. So I didn't do any of the ICP stuff. But I would get, the Fauna or other brands, and I would stick to whatever regimen there is. With, let's say, 3-4 months, and thinking that, okay, I'm seeing something. Well, the best results were where I actually stopped all of that, and I put that same amount of money that I was spending on this on just salt. And I just cranked it up, and that was probably the biggest change.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, 30% a month is actually quite a bit.
Yes.
Is that a single water change, or are you splitting that into 15% every 2 weeks or something?
Neither. I shot one video recently, but I'll do one more. I actually came to pretty much the best system in my opinion. So first of all, I do continuous water change. So I have the Versa that pumps throughout the day. I try to not do 24 hours. Instead, I try to move everything into 6 hours. But in 6 hours, my whole system display will get changed, let's say 6 gallons of water. Now that water right now goes into my farm. And then from that farm, another pump sends it into, I have 2 systems. One is a coral quarantine. It's a only 25 gallon innovative marine that has a drain. So it's an overflow into another aquarium that's underneath it. And this is my fish quarantine system. And then it goes into the drain.
Okay.
So this way, I do a massive water change. And in both of my coral quarantine system and fish quarantine system, I basically get, I would say, 60% water change or 50% water change every single day for free.
Yeah, because it's a smaller system. Okay, I see. So it's just everything's coming down the line and essentially at the end just overflowing down your drain. So it's whatever goes in comes out on the other end. Yeah, okay.
That is exactly right.
Okay, that's an interesting way to do it. I mean, I don't think everybody has the access to the plumbing or the sink to kind of make something like that work, but I definitely like that idea. Gives you like a interesting experiment too, by, like you say, if that smaller system's getting like a large water change. I mean, it's not brand new water. It's water out of the main system, but it's new to that system. So yeah.
Correct.
Okay. Well, that's kind of cool. Yeah, that's definitely something to consider if, like I say, if you can make it work. Super cool. Yeah. Okay, cool. Anything else to sort of say about anybody stuck in a bit of a rut with their tank? Anything to try or any ideas?
I think the best one is visiting other friends' systems or having people over at your place. I think, I've been doing it for about 15 years, and I was part of the Marine Aquarium Society of Toronto, MAST, which was we used to be the big deal back then. And one of the most exciting parts were, I think, once or twice a year, we would just spend a whole Saturday just going from one aquarium to another from people's houses. And this was, you learn a lot of things, but also you just get invigorated. You get excited about like, this guy or girl did this particular thing. I want to go in and I'm going to try this as well. So to get out of the rut, I think going and talking to other friends who are also care deeply for this hobby, I think this is probably the best medicine.
Yeah. Hey, and also Reef podcasts, hey?
Yeah. So
and content like yours, I mean, it's all inspiring, but we all get to that point where, we kind of go like, oh, what's something I can try? I want to actually see something change in my tank. I really want to actually be like, yeah, that definitely did something,
I have a Bluetooth speaker in my farm, and on the weekend I would tune in to your podcast because I like the depth and I love the long form, like not 20 minutes, whatever it is, but hearing from all those folks and the topics you cover. And when I do maintenance or just work on the corals, just having this in the background, probably it's exciting. Yeah, so I love it a lot.
Cool. Yeah, and sometimes it's like you fish through an hour of stuff to find one or two little tidbits that maybe you might consider applying or trying yourself. But that's the world we're in. There's so much to absorb and to 100%. Try. My last guest today is appearing for his third time on the podcast. It's Allan Vo from the Coral Reeftank. Allan got a lot of people thinking about coral nutrition and feeding and experimenting with this concoction, which is kind of a food bacteria mix. I think a lot of people tried it out in 2024. So if you tried it out, love to hear your experience in the comments below. I should just add, if you're just listening to this on the podcast apps and not watching the YouTube, Allan shows a graph, and I'll sort of try to explain it. It's kind of like a graph that shows that the beginning of a reef tank kind of has a curve where there's more maintenance involved, but coral health is on the lower side. And then as the tank starts to mature and the coral health goes up, the maintenance curve comes down and the coral curve goes up. So I'll put these in the YouTube video, but just keep that in mind if you're just listening. I thought this would be a good way to start off the year because I feel like I get into a bit of maybe a plateau or a bit of a rut in terms of where my reefing is at. And, my standards are high. So to most people, they would see my reef and they'd be like, everything looks great. But I'll be like, yeah, but it's just kind of like, it's fine. Like it could be better. And I've tried a lot of different things, but, I kind of wanted to try to maybe brainstorm some things that maybe make it tank get to a point where it does hit that plateau, and then what are some of the things that you could do that are sort of safe little shifts to kind of make a system, maybe go in a different direction, have a bit of a different look overall to how your corals look and just your general health?
Yeah, I mean, I think any like long-term experienced reefer is going to experience some type of plateau or issue long-term. I don't think, it's just normal for us to have like dips in like our human input. But the thing is, like, the most important thing in this hobby is to ensure consistency, and employing like a strict regimen is the only way that, you can prevent any, long-term volatility, I'd say. A pretty cool, interesting, I guess, a topic that we could kind of pull in is just the inherent lag times and expectations and rewards that we would expect in our reef tanks. So like, I kind of just drew something up here real fast.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can kind of view this, right? Let's say like the x-axis is, the beginning time point. Let's say x starts at 0 whenever you start your fish tank. And the first initial few months, you're going to go through a lot of ugly stages, right? And that's going to require you to, essentially input
more
front
husbandry.
load.
Yeah.
Essentially, right. And then once you start populating your corals, you're not going to see, your corals explode in growth overnight, right? Like the first time you dose your first calc or alkalinity supplementation, you're not going to expect that first boom. It's going to be repetitive input, consistent input, month over month, day over day. And then eventually, from there, you might reap some rewards if you're consistent, right? And in order for us to avoid, these ruts in our tanks, we go on vacations here and there. We forget to dose something now and then. Sometimes you forget to feed your tank, even, how crazy that might sound, right? You might look at all these animals and like, feed me, but you're like, oh, I forgot. It happens. So like the only way, we can avoid these things is create strict regimens, and build on our own abilities to understand the trends that we see, right? I mean, for us, you've probably been doing this over a decade, when things are starting to go good, and then you start kind of easing off, the husbandry, right? You think, things are looking great. Why do I have to do anything more? But that's when issues are going to peak, right?
Yeah, that complacency is sometimes the killer or the slow killer. Yeah.
Right. And another thing here, this is kind of going into some financial theory, but you can kind of think about these lines as like reaching upper and lower bounds, right? Essentially, it's like what I was saying earlier, right? When you reach that peak plateau in husbandry, you're going to wane down, right? You can only do so much. You can only spend so many hours with your tank. Eventually, that's not sustainable long term. But those days where you spend hours and hours plucking algae or something from your tank is what is going to lead to that, success a month or two down the road. But once you reach that success, you're so complacent because you're enjoying the moment, right?
Which is, what you should be doing as a reefer. That is the goal.
Right. That is the goal. But we have to understand our systems rely on us, right? There is no external mechanism to keep these things running. And you have to understand these closed systems are going to fluctuate up and down based on our inputs, right? And the only way for us to, essentially like smoothen out the curve is to look at our tank instead of, once every 5 days for like 10 hours, you just do 5 minutes a day or something like that. That analogy kind of converts, but essentially creating the strict regimen, it doesn't have to be extremely convoluted. You don't have to, program everything to be nitty gritty, but it's important for you to check on a few vital key points on your aquarium, right? Your life support systems. For me, it's understanding the calcium reactor drip rate, the amount of calcium and alkalinity consumption, and the algae that grows in the system, right? The amount of, let's say, algae or phytoplankton that is growing freely in your system is a great indicator of how much extra resources exist in your system. If you're seeing the film on your tank develop very like rich, strong green film every day, it's most likely over fertilized in the sense where the corals that you have in there are not utilizing the nitrogen input.
Yeah.
The algae is growing to overcompensate that, right?
Yeah, because this is excess sort of like photosynthesis that's able to happen because, there's other algae that's available to, I've always thought in some ways it's often that, macroalgae and other algae are competing with the coral. But I think in the case, like you talk about film algae, that's more of a case of excess, I would say, as an indication.
I think that film algae is a great indicator of excess nitrogen in the system, like free available nitrogen in the water. It's rapidly consumed. I think in the past I've been experimenting with like increased feeding or like phytoplankton. So kind of going into like this like methodology or how we can like prevent like old tank syndrome. It's about creating essentially like a self-sustaining ecosystem where we as the reefer have to input the least amount of energy for us to like, I guess, stay within the safe bound, right? And if we, hit all like the external barriers of our, this concept, like creating a stable reef environment, like biome, establishing organisms at different trophic levels, starting from the smallest level up to the largest level, are like apex predators in our tank. We can essentially have a not self-sustaining, but somewhat self-preserving ecosystem in the long term.
Yeah.
Mainly just from the light input, right?
Yeah.
Because everything essentially in the ocean would come from the sun. Everything derived from, zooplankton up to corals is, converting that light energy into biomass, right? But if we don't implement or establish our reef tanks with those organisms, there's no spontaneous generation, right?
Yeah. So, okay. But you're talking a lot about, building consistency. You mentioned inputs as well. I mean, knowing what your inputs are is obviously going to be that's almost everything as far as a system is all these inputs. But once you reach stability and you reach that part of the curve, like you showed, where the husbandry kind of drops off and becomes easier, what are some things if you kind of are like tired of looking at your tank and you feel like your tank's good, but you want something to change? I think what you're saying is if you understand everything that's going into your system, making a change is a little bit more quantifiable because you've been so consistent.
Yeah, I would say that. And then I think once you're able to, I guess, intrinsically quantify your specific system because you have a unique attachment to it, you're able to, let's say, like look into the future or have some perspective into the future, right? For me personally, I grow like very dense SPS systems. I think within, it sounds very, painful, but I think every 4 to 5 years, I run into major issues just due to how dense the systems become. Because like, I think I counted the other day, at the moment, I have over 100 different species in like 100 different acro species, just acros, in 160 gallons of volume.
That's not a very big tank.
So it is ridiculous at my scale, but it makes sense, right? I mean, most of my colonies get to around maybe 8 inches in size before they ultimately can't grow anymore because they're touching into each other.
Yeah.
And so my issue is I have to set up other systems to move them because I don't want to, eventually my tank, I know, can only really support 8-inch colonies. It's 160 gallons, over 100 different pieces. They need a lot of room. So I've been setting up separate systems to accommodate that. And because I've essentially run through this a few times, I understand when my systems kind of hit critical mass. I'll start noticing things kind of go awry here and there just because, your system just can't support this carrying capacity for long term, right?
Yeah.
You're going to grow, these corals grow exponentially larger
and
they grow exponentially faster and require exponentially more resources. And we as humans, we think in a linear scale, right? We can't really comprehend that unless we really dig down, write it out, and then compute it. Because then we can visualize it with our eyes. But if we are to do this little mental head math or headcanon math, it's not going to, I guess reality is not going to play to what we think most of the time.
Yeah, and this is kind of an analogy I've used a couple times on the podcast, but, for someone like you or I who has these massive, 8-10 inch colonies, that colony itself, and we have, you say, like you say, you have 100 plus of some of these, that colony could be the entire volume of coral in another tank, because that other tank is mostly frags and mini colonies, and people don't really, like it is hard to actually comprehend how much requirement there is for a large colony.
Yeah, that's incredibly true. And a lot of times when people, I guess, design the inhabitants of their reef tank, they don't really take into perspective the symbiotic relations that acros have. You know, if you look at it like a wild coral reef, a lot of these acropora colonies are covered with anthias and damselfish. Mm-hmm. And when you really notice a lot of these like really beautiful zeolite tanks, you also notice in correlation, they also have a lot of these like smaller reef fish that are commonly associated with these corals, right? And a lot of these people go into, let's say, like acro farming, and they're just like, I'm just going to need a few tanks, a few wrasses here and there. Mm-hmm. And they don't think about the long-term or like macro application. If you just get a few of those larger fish or like higher level trophic levels, you're going to be the person that has to essentially replace all those lower trophic levels, right? You're going to be replacing the damselfish. You're going to be replacing the copepods, because you essentially don't have anything to convert that biomass back into like accessible energy, right? Mm-hmm. That's why, you know, these reef ecosystems are essentially constant positive feedback loops, right? The minute something goes wrong with that feedback loop, you're going to cause essentially chaos in the system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Same thing with our tanks, right? You forget to, let's say, dose all your trace elements for a few weeks, and chaos ensues. You're going to have STN issues. Or if you were to forget your fish, like a really important thing is like people have to understand how to control inherent populations of organisms that exist in their tank, and maintaining this like theoretical equilibrium is very key in long-term sustaining of these closed ecosystems. Because you, like I said earlier, once you hit one of these upper or lower bounds, you're bound for a course correction, right?
Yeah.
You can't do incredible for too long, and you're not going to do horrendous for a long time.
No.
As long as you're still there, right?
But it's like you say, with a really heavily stocked system, it's like driving in the fast lane of the highway all the time. You know, you're kind of just like, you're probably, you know, you'll be fine for a while, but the risk is so much higher when you're at that rate. And I'm at that point. I mean, this is why I want to have this conversation, because my tank is like what you're saying. Everything is touching. All the colonies are just maxed out, and I'm starting to have some problems here and there. And it's like, you know, what should I do at this point? Should I chop some of these giant colonies down to a small, you know, sustainable size of what I need and put it on the porch? You know, it's at this point, I just don't know what to do. I'm not just going to set up more tanks. That's not the solution.
Yeah, I mean, everyone reaches that, you know, I can't set up any more tanks limit eventually. But it's all about, I guess, kind of analogous to what we're saying. Our tanks are very volatile systems, or volatile dynamics are occurring in our system just due to the way that, you know, we maintain our systems is very volatile. Corals grow like insanely fast, especially once you have these large colonies. You can, like, sometimes I look at the corals, take pictures, and I can notice polyps per day, like dozens of polyps encrusting and forming per day. And you're like, on a scale of like, you know, hundreds, or that magnitude is just kind of mind blowing, right? And your life support systems can only really support you for so long before imbalances or the immediate requests of these organisms are not met, right? You can only dose so much into the system and have it be readily available at the moment. A lot of these processes take time to occur, and, you know, the metabolic byproducts are not immediately available.
If we're going to talk about minor trace elements or something like that, and those imbalances that start to shift out, you know, the more the growth, the bigger the corals, the more those problems are going to be magnified and, you know, eventually lead to like real problems, you know?
Yeah. Essentially, you could say you have compounding issues.
Yeah. Compounding.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. The longer you run a closed system, you're going to run onto like compounding issues, right? You're going to run into equipment failure. You're going to run into, you know, husbandry lapses, you know, things like that, things out of your control. The longer you have any of these systems in play, the more entropy you're exposed to, right? The more chaos you're exposed to. And our goal is to mitigate that. And how good are you is all up to your own independent research and the time that you put into make yourself a better reefer.
But what are some things, you would say that could be a bit of a reset that could be good for a tank? Like something I don't do very often, but every once in a while I will pull, I do run quite a bit of live rock in my sumps. I'll pull all the rock out. I'll basically empty the sump completely, and I'll shop vac any detritus in the bottom. I'll take all the rock, I'll put it in separate bins, and I'll just blast it all with like a mag drive pump or something like that. Get all the detritus off, double rinse all of that rock, put it back in. That's sort of getting some of that, organic sort of matter out of the tank, which probably helps. But I don't notice a huge difference after that, to be honest.
I think it's like, most of the time, if you're doing it on a routine basis, you're not going to see the detrimental impact. Like as long as you stay up on your like detritus removal and all that inert stuff doesn't actually settle on the live tissue of the corals, you'll be fine. I've had issues where like a small patch of detritus will fall inside a large colony, and it will just radiate STN from that one small detritus patch.
Yeah, I've seen
and that's
that.
like this is the issue that you face if you don't, keep up with this husbandry, especially with SPS. They don't have that ability, like, let's say, like a large, like LPS, like in Acanthophilia, to slough off detritus. It's essentially a rock.
Yeah.
This rock is not going to push the dirt off of it. So a lot of these corals live in very high flow, strong energy reef areas. They're requiring the water to do that for them. If you're keeping SPS corals, you have to essentially keep a detritus-free aquarium.
Yeah.
Because if you have any detritus long-term, you're going to run into STN once your colonies get big.
Yeah.
And like a piece of dust lands in there, and then boom, it could be a week and you lose the whole colony without you even realizing.
Yeah. It's another one of those compounding issues is growth versus flow, and flow becomes more complex, the more filled in a tank gets too.
Yeah. And that's a very big issue. Like, how do you understand like when is flow like going to be like your critical limitation here? So like for me, like for my system, since I know like how many corals it can roughly keep, I try and keep that set amount, because I know like the minute I reach over a certain number of species, I'm going to run with like issues with interference. Like I've noticed at specific times I've had like speciosa die off. Or like tenuous die off, but like the other species like Rosaria or like Loripes or granulosus will be fine, and you're like, what is happening? Most likely, just at that key moment, something just ran out in the water column, I wasn't able to catch it in time. And certain corals are just more affected than others.
Yeah, I think that some corals, the biological processes that are firing to make everything work in a coral between its tissue, its skeleton, all of the processes that are happening, I think some corals are just more sensitive to those processes being, messed around with.
And it's, if anyone's like familiar with like horticulture or keeping like, fancy flowers or even like gardening, you'll understand like the corollaries that will, go into your reef tank. Your tomatoes don't grow the same as your pumpkins, or like your spinach or whatnot, right? They're going to have different requirements. Sure, they might generally be, a vegetable or a gourd or whatnot, but their individual unique requirements are going to be different. Like a lot of these, like a lot of the vegetables that we consume were not from the New World. A lot of them were brought over from the Old World, and we grow them in the New World and vice versa, right? But the only reason we were able to do that is that we understood intrinsically where these things originated from, and we were able to try and replicate their environments.
Yeah.
What we run into is, like I said earlier, we try and jam pack as many different things from as many different oceans as possible.
Yeah.
And we say, all right, let it rip.
Yeah.
It doesn't rip too well.
No, and again, it's like we don't have hundreds of years of raising these things.
And
yeah.
Right. And, I guess our data set and our sample size for a lot of this is very small in terms of what is publicly available. And a lot of it, if you're not like a long-term reefer, is going to be from personal or, anecdote.
Yeah. Yeah. Very hobby-based. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It's going to be pretty much like a lot of these like reefers, or a lot of the old generation reefers probably had, ancient or like tons of like beneficial knowledge, like, kind of like the ancient Romans or Greeks that are probably lost to time now because they didn't write anything down or communicated with anyone. And, these people were probably just, growing tanks out of their bathroom, no issue. But, today with all our technology, we can emulate it, and you can kind of see, the same issues with modern society, right? We look back at our, ancient historic greatness, and we're like, why can't we do it now?
Yeah. Well, we also have a lot of good things figured out now that they didn't have figured out back then. So.
Oh, sure. I mean, it goes both ways.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Okay. So what would be something you would say to someone that feels like they have hit a bit of a plateau? They've been consistent with their husbandry, and they've kind of hit that point where maybe, like your graph was showing, where the husbandry has kind of gotten a little easier, but they feel like the tanks just kind of, the colors are okay, the growth is okay, but they're ready to sort of make a change. Like it's really the golden question is really, what's something I can do to make my tank better? Like nobody can really answer that. But what are some things maybe you have tried or you've seen somebody make a bit of a shift where they've kind of seen a pretty clear, evidence that whatever the change they made actually did improve the system?
Yeah. I mean, I think, I guess there's a lot of facets to that question, a lot of different avenues that you could go down.
You could also talk about the concoction a little bit, because, you've seen enough people try your concoction now that you probably have gotten quite a bit of feedback from it.
Yeah. I mean, I guess for my personal answer to your question, what I did when I kind of saw my systems plateau was I applied my own external interest outside of the hobby. And I tried to apply that to the hobby, right? Like what, I guess this is like an idea in game theory, right? You're two agents or two people are playing the same game, but no one really thinks about refusing the game and playing another game or modifying the game, right? We can essentially do that with our tanks or our reefs, right? No one is telling you to play by a strict set of rules. Everyone comes to the table with their own unique strengths and weaknesses. And if you play to your strengths, you can essentially create something or innovate on something that no one has thought of before. Like with the concoction, it just kind of came to me, and I was thinking, how can I, essentially do less work on my tanks and reap more benefits? And what I saw was, a lot of these things kind of boil down to feeding the system and ensuring that nutrition is consistently applied. And to do that and essentially like micromanage the nutrient input to the system is a ton of work. And if you can essentially design a system with the fish and the key critical inputs into it, you don't have to really do much. You can just kind of set and forget it.
Yeah.
Let's say kind of going back to this, like another, application of my answer would be like the advent of aquarium controllers, right? People plateaued with their fish tank and they're like, how can I make my system better? Well, I'm going to invent, I have a, interest in, computer science. I'm going to create a way to digitally monitor and, control my reef tank.
Yeah.
Isn't that taking it to the next level? For me, it was, I'm growing corals at such an exponential rate. If I don't consider their needs, I'm going to run into brick walls month over month. Mm-hmm. And for me to break through that barrier, I, came up with my concoction, and I was able to do that. Yeah. I'm able to grow corals faster. I'm able to retain like that luster. And kind of going back to that question, that metallic sheen on acros and corals, I'm pretty sure it's due to availability of nitrogen.
Yeah. And
yeah,
okay, but what about nitrogen versus ammonia and the process of everything in between? Because we talked about this before, but what are your thoughts on dosing ammonia versus nitrate and how that would be part of that?
So, but let me preface by saying I don't have an extreme I don't have a background in chemistry, but what I think is it's kind of similar to what is observed in horticulture and gardening, in the sense of creating using a fertilizer. Ammonia and nitrogen are common fertilizers used in gardening. Mm-hmm. And the usage of ammonia kind of relies on the microbes to break it down into free nitrogen for the plants to absorb, right?
Yeah.
You can't really dose nitrogen directly. Nitrates or ammonia is probably the most common form, but if you can dose nitrogen through, let's say, another biological molecule, perhaps like proteins or food, right? The corals can also get the other bioactive molecules if you choose to go a different route. If you're just let's say targeting just, ammonia bicarbonate, you're essentially forgetting the bigger picture of things, right? You're forgetting all the molecules that come along with this nitrogen in a natural system, right? The coral would be getting the nitrogen in the ocean from its heterotrophic consumption.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I guess, it's like we need fat in our diet, but we don't just drink olive oil,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, like the plant would get nitrogen from like a bug or like an animal dying, and then the animal decaying and turning into soil, right? Kind of the same thing. You could kill a bunch of animals or, fertilize a field that way, or you could just sprinkle some, fertilizer onto it and have it instantaneously. So this is like, using this logic or like kind of these similar analogies into our hobbies, right? Gardening, into reef keeping, because essentially they're controlled by the same system, nature.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think, something I've come to realize about, the concoction or this sort of idea of, I don't know, breaking down a food to a more almost kind of digested form. It's kind of like you're kind of dosing fish poop into your tank or something similar to that, which is, kind of what I think the corals are using more anyways.
Yeah, there are a few interesting studies going into regarding the excrement and the mineralization of fish excrement. Very interesting to like look into. And then what I was saying earlier, what fish live around specific corals, you're going to realize, these fish are probably just feeding the corals a ton more than you think.
Constantly.
And if you don't have those fish, you could potentially be like wasting the food that goes into your tank. Because let's say your tang is not going to digest the same food or digest the food the same way as like, a damsel is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like, it's kind of interesting, like, kind of think about a cow and how a cow just eats a ton of grass, but is able to build on, incredible amounts of protein and muscle mass. It's due to, the cows having multiple stomachs, it processing the raw inputs in multiple ways. And then at the end of the day, consuming the bacteria that is breaking down all of the fiber, in the hay. Right.
Okay. Yeah. Because it's something interesting about that, and I think I kind of came to this realization, and probably a lot of people that know more about chemistry and biology would be obvious, but really what a protein is it's just like a composition of, it's a rearrangement of molecules, really. So like you're talking about with the cow, it's digesting grass, which is not really protein, and it's finding a way to sort of rearrange these molecules into protein, really.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you could break down what an amino acid or a protein is by its textbook definition. And then you could be like, oh, wow, there's so many different applications that I never realized. And I think that's another, little aspect that a lot of people don't look at. They kind of just take the surface level, explanation. But if you understand the core component and the definition of each word that you're reading or applying to this reef tank, you're going to go down so many more interesting rabbit holes and just feel your inherent or intrinsic love for the hobby, right? It's about trying to be open-minded and trying to find new passions in places where you never thought you would like.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you and I are into that. Not everybody is going into super research mode. But
you don't have to. I think the key thing that everyone can and is free to do is employ some introspection. Just journal, maybe look back, or just try and remember what you did onto the tank. Having a introspective moment is, I think, 100% or the most important thing in being a successful long-term reefer. If you're always living in the moment, sure, that's great.
Yeah.
But you can never capitalize on your greatness, right? You're only living on how good you are right now. But if you never understood why you are here, how you got here, you're never going to be able to be like, all right, I can see the future and I want to be there. You're only just going to be here all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have photos on my phone of, thousands of coral photos. And sometimes I look back and I'm just scrolling or whatever. And I'm like, damn, that, cherry bomb looked really good in, June 2023 or something. And then I'll go, okay, what other data do I have I can look at around that time? What was I doing? Was I feeding, this combination of foods? Do I have an ICP from around that time? And I can go back and, maybe assess like, oh, maybe I was doing this a little better back then, and that's why, maybe you can sort of get a little bit of information from that.
Yeah, I mean, it's the most important thing long term is to be able to build a robust data set that you can personally leverage and look back upon for your personal, reflection and future projection, essentially. I guess you could put, that into that framework. Or you could just really boil it down into, play it by gut. But that's a really hard skill to develop. You have to be really doing this for a long time to, let's say, reef by gut feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, like we said, for me, I can look back at the mid 2023, let's say a year and a half ago exactly. My coral volume in the tank was much lower, so there's factors that are just so hard to really figure out because, the consumption of the system was very different back then. So even if I look at ICPs and I try to go, was it this trace element? Was it, was it the nutrient ratio? It's really hard to say because things have grown so exponentially since then. And I can't say that that's all of the corals I wanted to grow exponentially. There's some really nice high-end tenuous that I wish were, 12-inch colonies now, but,
Yeah, it's always the ones that you don't expect just to be forever stunted.
Yeah. It tends to be the most expensive ones.
Yeah,
but
I
that's
guess
why they stay expensive.
They cost
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, yeah. Supply and demand, baby.
Totally. Thanks for joining us for this episode, and thank you to all the guests for being a part of this, and thanks for another year of Beyond the Reef. I'm really happy that this is working out the way it is, and I really appreciate your support via the Patreon, all the subscribers and likes and shares. I hope this episode got you inspired for the new year and wanting you to try some new things in your reef tank. Just another shout out to our sponsor, Fauna Marine. So many great products by this company. I use a lot of them in my systems. Otherwise, I wouldn't have them as a sponsor. Just a reminder that I am a certified ICP consultant for Fauna Marine. So if you want to have your results analyzed or just go over a general issue in your tank, you can go to my Patreon at patreon.com/beyondthereefpodcast. If you have any suggestions for future guests, want to ask me a question, or just reach out in general, you can email me at beyondthereefpod@gmail.com. And if you're looking for high-quality aquacultured corals in Canada, please go to my website at fraggarage.ca. Hope to hear from you soon.